Good morning, everybody. This is a new experience. Welcome very much to the second UK Literacy Association online seminar. Just to give you a little bit of an outline, I believe you can see the presentation and me. All I can see from the 106 and growing number of people is a little chat panel at the bottom. What I've planned is to talk to you today about supporting multilingualism in the classroom, and there is an opportunity in the middle to ask questions. And if nobody makes use of that opportunity, it will be me talking for pretty much an hour straight. So I'm hoping that the chat panel works for you. And I'm looking forward to having some interaction with you as we go along. So by way of introduction, my name's Sabine Little. I'm a lecturer in languages education at the University of Sheffield. I've been there for many years on and off, and I also lead or convene the Literacy and Multilingualism Special Interest Group of the UK Literacy Association. So my contact details are on screen right now, and if anybody who is not yet a member of the Special Interest Group would like to become a member going forward, then I would be very happy to hear from you. And at the moment, as you can imagine, everything is slightly in flux, but we are getting things online and things are definitely happening. I've said I would talk about multilingualism in the classroom, and essentially I want to begin about talking about, oh, I've got an hello, sorry. It's good to know that that's working. Essentially what I want to talk about is why heritage language development is important, and part of that is being my research. I've been working for years in schools and with multilingual families, and part of that has been comparing family hopes and expectations about heritage language development juxtaposed with the pressure that comes from the curriculum. Note that I'm not saying it comes from the teachers. I'm very much aware that teachers are working in a very pressurized environment. And part of today's talk will hopefully be to also think through some ideas for the classroom to support multilingual students without that being detrimental to English language curriculum requirements. After those bits, I've introduced a little pause for questions, and then I've made some time to talk about the Multilingual Children's Library here in Sheffield, because it's been the most amazing project that I've been involved in as part of my research, and I'm hoping that it will be of interest to other people on here as well. I want to start with a little personal example. My son, Obi, is now 12 years old. I am German. I was born in Germany. I moved to the UK age 18, and my husband is born and bred in Sheffield in the UK, and he doesn't speak any German. So when our son grew up, we had to make decisions about how to bring him up multilingually. And literacy development, as it does in many, many families, developed asynchronously. And what I have here by way of an example is what my son was reading at the same time at the age of 9 in German on the left-hand side and in English on the right-hand side. So on the right-hand side, you've got Never Say Die, the Alex Rider that was new at the time when he was 9 years old. And on the left-hand side, you've got a book that is in German, age 6 and above, and is intended to be at just that cusp where children are starting to read for themselves slightly longer books, but there is definitely, much shorter sentences. And unsurprisingly, my son was not particularly inspired by the German reading that he did, because the English language reading he could access was much more complex. The story development was much more thrilling. It was much more topical about the kinds of things that he was interested in. So at the time, he was beginning to question his identity as a multilingual person. On the one hand, his spoken German was quite similar to his English, but his reading, it was far behind. And he sort of lost confidence in his belief of himself as being German. And part of what I want to talk about is the kind of cultural capital that comes from growing up multilingually and being part of several cultures. Now, many of you will have heard about Bourdieu's notion of cultural and social capital, this idea that we have assets, we have capital that is not financial, but that is linked to how confident we are in a variety of contexts, how our manners and behaviors fit in with certain groups of people, whether we can hit the appropriate register when we talk to people culturally. And rather than being disadvantaged, children from heritage language backgrounds have got a lot more opportunities to increase their cultural and social capital because they grow culturally and linguistically in two or more slices, groups of society. But this can become problematic because society does not necessarily equate all of the capital as equal. Again, to use my son as an example, growing up bilingual in English and German, German being a leading nation economically, historically, etc., and German being taught in the UK as a foreign language, when he says to people that he speaks German, that is often met with, oh, wow, that's amazing. And most people can stretch to, oh, 2 Bier bitte, or I am 12 years older, or similar short sentences in German. And there is a form of connection there. And I remember that when he was about 7 years old, there were only 3 multilingual children in his class, and one of them was speaking Czech. And this little girl felt that there was no real connection because when she said she spoke Czech, people went, oh, that's nice, that's great. But then it kind of stopped there because people weren't really always aware of people, cultural context, etc., that would connect to her heritage culture. So what I'm trying to say here is that in any country, but I think particularly in Anglophone countries, the way the curriculum and the way the government connects with speakers of other languages is mixed, and the cultural capital that children bring to the classroom isn't always recognised at governmental level. If you look at the policies, for example, that govern speakers of other languages, you will find that they are most often linked to bridging the gap, making sure that these speakers of other languages hit the English language targets rather than looking at it from an enrichment perspective. I realise that if you are here, I'm highly likely preaching to the converted. But I have got a few more slides about the curriculum context coming up in a minute. In my research, I did a study where I worked with 212 different families, and I was asking for reasons for maintaining the heritage language. And the reasons that the families gave were on a lot of different levels. And listed here are, for example, the familial ones, the connection to relatives, which are essentially emotional reasons, a cultural desire for children to remain connected to heritage culture, to the roots, but also things connected not to the past, like being connected to the heritage culture, or the present, maintaining links with family, but also to the future. So, for example, a desire for the child to potentially be able to move to the home country or to have an increased chance for employment. But there were also reasons that were very difficult to put into words. And in the coding of the data, I linked them to the emotional and connective. Essentially, what parents were saying was that they could not imagine children not speaking the heritage language. And when we talked more about this, we discovered this identity-linked connection between parents and their children, which was filtered through language. And out of that study came this framework, which I'll briefly introduce, but I won't dwell too long on it. Essentially, looking at it, you have an axis of essential and peripheral reasons for maintaining a heritage language and pragmatic and emotional reasons for maintaining the heritage language. And if we start at the top left, where we have a quadrant of pragmatic and essential reasons, these are the kinds of families where heritage language is needed for the family to function. So where children, for example, might work as translators for the parents, or where family members like a grandparent live in the home who do not speak the language. And in those families, the need to pass on the language isn't really questioned by anybody. It's understood as an essential need. I'm mindful in the current situation of essential reasons for leaving the home. There are some reasons that are so clear and straightforward, nobody would question them. But on the right-hand side, we have the essential emotional reasons. And there are the connections that I spoke about earlier, where parents were saying they couldn't imagine their child not speaking the language. I've spoken and worked with families where there isn't a clear level of communication between the parents and the children. If one parent feels more confident speaking in the heritage language, but the child does not feel confident speaking the heritage language, then there is no real singular level of language where these intergenerational family members can meet to talk about anything, really. And I'll talk a bit later about how that translates through the school life as well. And this kind of emotional well-being is something that is becoming better understood. When I started this research, it was less well understood. So essentially in these families, the need to pass on the heritage language is linked to emotional well-being and mental health. More straightforward, we have the quadrants at the bottom. So for example, heritage language as practical, convenience as peripheral. So that would be the opportunity to, for example, make friends or play while you're on holiday, or potentially the opportunity to enter the job market or add another language to your skill set for later life. And also then on the right-hand side, peripheral emotional reasons for socio-emotional convenience. Now, these are fluid. For example, the need for the child to be able to communicate with a grandparent very much depends on how connected the family is as to whether that is an essential need or a peripheral need. Ultimately, what I'm saying is that when we talk about multilingual families and their needs, every single family is different and the needs and experiences are different. But when we talk about language, it is almost impossible to talk about language without considering identity as part of it, and to what extent how children experience their different languages in the school and home context impacts on this identity development. And in my research, parents are often caught between school expectations and hopes for the heritage language. So very often when I talk to families and they have a child who's aged about 5, they say, well, school started and we didn't want them to fall behind, so we focused on the English, but then our language fell behind. But it's important that our child does well in school. So parents often have to make this trade-off between which language to support. Some manage to do everything, and hats off to those families, but there are many families that are struggling as well. Teachers are also stuck in this conundrum. We did a study where we interviewed 40 teachers between teaching reception to year 6, and what we found was that many teachers were hoping to support multilingualism in the classroom, but on the one hand weren't 100% certain how to do this, and on the other hand felt that there was a lot of pressure coming from the curriculum and the government to make the English language the focus of instruction, as one might argue, it being the national language is the core focus of the education system. However, in The Guardian yesterday, there was an interesting article about the role of teachers, and it was linked to the current crisis. And it was interesting because I think the article is titled something like, "Education was never the core focus of school." And it talks about identity development and care. So there are interesting discussions happening right now. To what extent it will filter down to the curriculum, I do not know. But I'm interested in the links between well-being, language use, and identity. A more recent way of thinking about the kind of knowledge that children bring to the classroom is the funds of knowledge approach by Gonzalez, Moll and Amanti from 2005. Now, similar to cultural capital, it is this idea that there are funds of cultural values, customs, beliefs, etc., that are developed at home, but that may not correspond to formal education contexts or the contexts of that their peers have. So there then comes a clash potentially, that if one child has different experiences and they're trying to participate in school socially as well as educationally, these funds of knowledge are being negotiated amongst children themselves. And in my research, I've done a study where we were looking at these funds of knowledge linked to, that's why it says at the bottom there, includes parental political views as well, where we were looking at how children of a young age enact their funds of knowledge around Trump, Brexit, politics, immigration, identity, language, etc., in the classroom. And some of that touched on dark funds of knowledge. So this idea that it sounds great to talk about the funds and cultural values that people bring and the customs and beliefs, etc. Of course, we have children in our classroom whose funds of knowledge are linked to experiences that we wouldn't wish on anybody, let alone a child, and that these funds of knowledge exist, need acknowledging as well. How are we doing for time? Okay. I want to move on to the English context. And I've been specific in saying English as in England, not English speaking, because obviously Wales and Scotland have got their own language related curricula. Now, language was first part of the census in 2011. So we actually only have one lot of census data where language was included. However, the way this was used is quite different as well. There are studies, for example, which look at the need for doctoral care or health linked to language, that don't take into account all the knowledge that comes out of the census. But that's by the by. We are at a point where approximately 20% of students are first or second generation immigrants, and a similar number speak English as an additional language and or are multilingual. Now, I'm being very explicit with these phrasings because, for example, the fact that my son speaks German was never a particular point of discussion at school until EAL funding came in. And then it became of interest how many children actually speak another language, because it meant additional funding to the school. So there are a large number of multilingual pupils. I've worked with pupils in year 6 in schools where nobody even knew that they spoke another language at home. So when we talk about multilingual pupils, it's very difficult to get an accurate figure because the way the question is being asked is not always beneficial to finding out what the true figures are. I've mentioned already earlier that language is largely treated as a deficit model in education across policy. So essentially, multilingual learners are particularly of interest while they are not coping. And once they are coping from a curriculum perspective, then they get subsumed into the student body at large. And again, this is not arguing that as a shortcoming of teaching or the teaching profession. It is simply a way that the way assessments work, etc., is this idea of, okay, let's make sure people hit the mark, but things that are not even on the curriculum, for example, Arabic, how do you then treat that as a strength when there is no way to actively showcase that through the SATs and other reporting systems? Now, Ofsted has highlighted, this is fairly old, I'll admit, that bilingual learners are being underestimated, but also that good oral skills may mask literacy support needs. So what Ofsted were saying at this point in time is that if students do not necessarily hit the curriculum targets in English, then their skills in other subjects might be underestimated. So, for example, being a great mathematician or scientist, if they do not have the language to express that in English, that might not come to the fore. The focus then is on learning English rather than embracing what is called the full linguistic repertoire. And I just want to pause briefly because there have been different ways of talking about multilingualism. And for a long time, we talked about multilingualism as one person with 2 or more separate language, I'll call them barrels. And depending on what you were using, you were dipping in and out of a particular language barrel. Now, what is happening in reality and what's come through over the last 5-8 years maybe, is this idea that actually there aren't separate barrels for the separate languages. There is one barrel in which all linguistic and language related knowledge is in, and people dip in and out of this as and when needed. So this means that when I talk to my son, for example, we will translanguage, which means that we will draw on whichever word most expresses what we want to talk about. And children who might have that kind of experience at home can struggle. Sorry. Hello? Yes. Oh, hang on a second. Hang on. this is what happens. My sincere apologies. I thought that that might have been Trish with an online issue, but it wasn't. So you end up picking the phone. So my apologies. I wouldn't normally pick up the phone while I'm talking online, but it wasn't a number that I recognised. So back to the full linguistic repertoire. So the families that I work with, if a child at home is used to utilising their full linguistic repertoire and jumping between languages, but in school they have to use just one of the languages that they are capable of speaking, then essentially they are trying to navigate the entire education system with one arm tied behind their backs. In addition, over the past few years, formal qualifications in heritage languages have been cut down quite drastically. And most heritage language education is taking place in community schools rather than in the main classroom. Now that schools are in a situation where they receive most funding directly, that means that theoretically there is more control what it can be spent on, but of course we all know that that funding is limited in real terms and is decreasing year on year. And that SATs and league tables are putting increasing pressure on learning and teaching in the primary years. So all of this has meant that there has been no centralised focus on EAL and languages other than English. It's not part of the inspection criteria, and essentially it is now down to a number of foundations such as NALDIC and the Bell Foundation and grassroots hubs doing much of the work. Talking about literacy development then, literacy is not a neutral space, and what we, or rather what our children experience in the classroom is not neutral. It's a social practice arising out of cultural needs and goals. So if we talk about literacy, we can really only talk about literacies at the same time, or we run the danger of ignoring all the language skills that our children bring with them. So when I did my research with multilingual families, one of the things that I was trying to find out was how biliteracy development, going back to my own son's experiences earlier on, translate to other families, other groups. And I'm not the only one doing research in this area. A supportive peer group has been identified as the most important success factor to bilingual and bilateral development, but also as children get older, peers have greater influence than parents when it comes to book choices. So in a recent study I did that was funded by the UK Literacy Association, I was looking at reading experience of children aged 8 to 13 and where they got their recommendations from. And even in that year group, it was very clear that the younger ones mainly got their recommendations from family members, parents, but as they got older, from teachers, from peers, school librarians, those who were lucky to have one. So therefore, if we combine that with advertising, reading lists, curriculum requirements, it can be really difficult to maintain the reading in the home and heritage languages. So the older the children get, the more the anglophone development or influence takes hold. So what then is the role of schools in this? In the study that I mentioned, where we interviewed 40 teachers, the teachers were mainly concerned that they didn't have the language or pedagogical skills to integrate multiliteracies. And they felt that, well, out of the 40 that we interviewed, only one of them was multilingual themselves. And there was a distinct shortage of training opportunities as well. But a lot really can be done to increase the status of multilingualism, which is part of what it's about, and which I will be talking more about when I speak about the Multilingual Children's Library later, and facilitate discussion and make it easier for children to remain engaged with their different languages without having to be a language specialist or being able to speak all the languages in the classroom. So I've got 2 slides of ideas, and some of those might be teaching Granny to suck eggs, and some of those might come up against, I don't know, funding cuts, which I wouldn't be surprised about. But I will go through them one by one, say a bit more, and then we are at the point to take questions if that is appropriate, if anybody has questions. Again, I can see the attendee number 122 now, and I'm speaking to my computer. So in terms of things that can be done, one of the easiest things, especially at primary school level, those schools that still have those read at home diaries. I had an experience where I wrote a German book into my son's read at home diaries, and we received a note back from the school, a very friendly note, but it said to please focus on the English language reading rather than reading in other languages. It was okay for that to occur, but for that not to be put into the diary. And I wrote a note back explaining that if the child speaks multiple languages at home and only one of those languages is deemed important enough to make it into the read at home diary, then that actually sent a really bad message to my child about the status of the different languages at home. And since I had that experience myself, and you're going back several years now, quite a few years, I've made it a part of my research question in every family that I've spoken with, and I've amassed a huge amount of different experiences from schools that have been really encouraging, but also a large number of parents who never even thought of adding reading in the home language into their child's reading. So starting a multilingual section in the library is slightly more complicated, but when I talk about the Multilingual Children's Library later, there will be some ideas there how to get that started. For example, there are ways of asking parents to hand out books that are no longer needed in the home, or to liaise with authors and librarians. When I talk about the Multilingual Children's Library later, I will talk about reading rewards that are linked to multilingual reading. That gets quite ambitious, but is obviously a way of engaging children at that level. Simply asking about multilingual reading is another way of just celebrating the kind of knowledge and skills that children are developing. And having a display board for non-English books is another way of just sharing what goes on. I've done a project where I went into schools and I read The Town Musicians of Bremen, which is a German fairy tale, a folk story about a donkey, a dog, a cat, and a cockerel. And I went into both very multilingual and very monolingual classrooms. And in telling the story, I would pause and I would say, how do you say donkey in your language? What is the sound that a cockerel makes in your language? And it's the most fun I've ever had in a classroom, because to give you just 2 examples, in English, obviously, that's cock-a-doodle-doo. In German, the cockerel goes kikeriki. And if I could now, I would share with you all the knowledge that the children suddenly had that was valid to share in the classroom, to talk about what it was in Malay, in Filipino, or in Tagalog, or whichever language. And the teacher said to me afterwards that there were children speaking during that storytelling session who wouldn't normally speak in class because they didn't feel that they had anything to share. So this didn't take long as part of the overall storytelling, just quickly asking the children to share, oh, what is dog in your language? But to make that a recurrent thing so that children feel that they have knowledge to bring to the classroom, they can connect their languages. The other thing that happened with that exercise was that children got really interested in language because they would say, oh, actually, dog in your language sounds very similar to dog in my language. They were starting to become linguistic thinkers. At a full-on level, encouraging children to share their full linguistic identities is essentially to make them believe and understand that they don't have to leave their languages behind when they enter the school doors or the school gates. At a more advanced level, there are ways to allow children, for example, draft work multilingually, even if it has to be handed in English only. And this depends very much on the year group. Now, to be able to share stories or to share parts of stories, that if you write a story and you don't know all in English, okay, fine. Put in your language whatever bits you need to put in and just make sure that the story flows and then work it out. Again, I'm fully aware that some of these are time consuming, some of these need funds. So I'm throwing out ideas into the void. And staff training, I think, I don't know, but there have been some staff that I think would like to have more, I don't want to say ammunition because I don't want to use a military metaphor, but would like to have more knowledge and understanding around the links between language and identity in order to defend those classroom practices. And if the UKLA Literacy and Multilingualism Special Interest Group can help there, I'd be very happy to help people out. Now, this is the slide that I normally have. However, I have added one more, specifically aware of the conscious of the current situation, and that is that many schools, I'm aware, are doing online learning at the moment. And when all this started, this move to online, I tweeted a tweet which I was surprised how much traction it got, but I essentially said, hats off to all multilingual families who are juggling English language school expectations with home family language policy and practices. And that tweet got a lot of interest. So I was thinking, hang on, now is a prime opportunity to get parents involved and to get children to understand that learning can take many different shapes and forms. So, for example, a class could have a competition of taking as many photos of books in other languages on the bookshelves from the kids and submit them and curate them and make them visible. I know you're busy as it is. I'm very much aware of that. Or for more technically advanced children or people, the idea of videoing reading in languages and uploading that to spaces, like internal school spaces. I'm not going to touch on privacy on sharing things online. I know that every school will have its own very well developed policy on this, so I'm not going to touch on this. Asking children to look for and share online stories, either audio stories or written stories in the languages that are represented in class, and create that as a hub and ask children to explore and say, oh, actually, can you have a look and explore 3 other languages that are spoken in class and have a listen and see what you think, for example. And then a more classic one, if you don't know about it, the Mother Tongue, Other Tongue poetry competition is open to both English language speakers who learn another language and heritage language speakers. And the link is there. It's a bit split, but I'm hoping it still makes sense. And obviously, when we share the recording of this, that link will be available as well. So it's 20 to 12, and this is where I was going to pause just in case there are any questions. So I will stare at the little chat box. And give people time to type if necessary. There are questions in the question section. Where is the question section? Now this is the bit that we should have trialed. I can only see the chat. I can't see a question section. I'm very sorry. Thank you. How can we as teachers approach teaching writing to multilingual students in an asset-based way, thinking specifically about helping them improve without always focusing on persistent grammar mistakes, etc.? That's a really great question, and I think it is something that heritage language parents have tried to tackle for a long time, because they're in exactly the same position. They're trying to encourage language acquisition, and they're not quite sure when and how to focus on the difficulties and problems. So part of it is about working with the children as well. Sometimes, again, I realise it takes longer time, but going through a text with children, sometimes if it's a quick error, one that isn't necessarily embedded, but that just happened because of speedy work, shall we say. If it's something persistent, there is a rating of how important it is. If it's something that is that will be needed again and again, then it's worth pointing out. But also, I would say that there are times and places that, for example, sometimes it might be worth focusing on writing for the sake of the flow, and then at other times for the sake of grammar and arguments. But the other thing I think is that if we point out the assets as well, then it becomes easier to handle the grammar mistakes, or asking children themselves to work out. I think sometimes what made my life teaching easier, I think, is because I speak multiple languages, is that I can work out whether the grammar mistakes come from the grammar of the other language. So if there is a persistent grammar mistake, it might simply be that the grammar of the heritage language functions in a different way. And if that is the case, then that is actually a fairly straightforward thing to point out, because the mistake has a reason. So if there is access, or if the child knows the language well enough, it might be possible to say, how would you say that sentence in your own language? And if you translate that word for word, is that where the mistake comes from? What are my thoughts on translanguaging? I do it all the time. I firmly believe this idea that multilingual people are just one person with one set of languages. In fact, we are tidying up our attic at the moment, and one of the things I found was my old study book in Italian. And I hadn't realised that at the time, because I wasn't a linguist at the time, but I was living in the UK, and it was in my third or second year of living in the UK. And I realised that I had in the left-hand column the Italian, and in the right-hand column my translations were either in English or in German at the time, because I used whichever way I was more likely to remember. So even before there were words for code switching or translanguaging, I think I was already making use of all my languages in the best possible way. What is the role of oracy in helping multilingual students? I think it has a huge role, and I think it has a role. I'm racing through these questions because now there's quite a few, but I apologize if I don't necessarily answer them completely. But in terms of oracy, I think it is massively important, partially because it includes older generations through the form of oracy or oral storytelling in this case, but also in terms of building confidence, where not everything has to be written down, and where the links between the written and the oral are not always as straightforward. So German, for example, is a very straightforward language. What you see is what you get. What's on the paper is essentially how you can read it, and that more or less makes sense. Now, English, I think, is a terribly difficult language. You will all know more about that than I do. So I think oracy, in terms of exploring language, is hugely important, and is also a way of bringing in parents who might not necessarily have written skills in either English or the heritage language. It depends which generation they themselves are. So I think there are multiple ways to use oracy. I've experienced resistance to encouraging heritage language from those who have a heritage language themselves. One multilingual co-worker said it did not help the EAL students learn English. Any thoughts on that? Yes, I do. I have a lot of thoughts on that. And I think it links to curriculum pressures. And I think it links to how we tend to generalize our own experiences, making them applicable to other people. I don't know your multilingual co-workers' life experiences. I don't know how they learnt English. I don't know when they learnt English. I think part of it is that we don't necessarily encourage multilingualism in the classroom to improve the English. However, having said that, I think we encourage multilingualism in the classroom to raise status of multilingualism, to raise the sense of status, to make it a place of belonging. Having said that, I also genuinely do believe that it does raise the knowledge of English, because it enables students to make more links between the languages. So there's been a lot of research, and you'll be familiar with some, that even if multilingual students start their school experiences at a lower cognitive level or a lower assessment performance-based level, that at some point they may or do overtake the monolingual learners. The problem we have is that our education system is not set up to track this over a period of multiple years. So if we encourage children to use all their languages, that doesn't mean that their learning will improve in 3 months. It might confuse them for 3 months, it might confuse them for 6 months, it might give them time to ultimately figure things out in a year, 2 years, 3 years. And the education system, the way we measure success, isn't set up for this. And that is part of what I'm lobbying for as part of my research. So yes, I would agree that it might not be the short-term answer, but I would say that it is one answer. I think we've done that one. What do you think about training, including a discussion ground of individual experience to potentially find your own links patterns? I'm not multilingual, but my partner is. And I know he has many examples of navigating English at school and Tagalog at home. So from my own experience, multilingual families are delighted to encounter somebody, anybody who, if not has first-hand experience, then acknowledges some experiences. And I do think the own links and patterns are very much important as part of this. My own research has been very much facilitated, bearing in mind I spend a lot of time with multilingual families. My own research has been very much facilitated by being a multilingual mum. I've done interviews where you will hear that I don't necessarily brandish a German accent when I talk, and sometimes I forget to mention it. So I've had interviews where I started talking and I could feel the sense in the room, the I don't know, change when it transpired that I was bringing up the multilingual child as well. Now, not everybody's multilingual and we're not expecting everybody to be multilingual, but I absolutely think that talking to a variety, and previously we had the experience of the co-worker who didn't think it was being helpful, and here somebody with a multilingual partner, I think personal experiences and sharing those, a large part I think is about encouraging children to acknowledge or to see that their multilingual experiences that they have at home are mirrored in the wider world, and that they are important and that they are seen. So I would absolutely encourage finding your own links and patterns and work those. Do you have any advice on obtaining books that recommend to one another in a variety of language for the school library? So I don't want to put pressure on lovely authors, but on my work with the Multilingual Children's Library, over time, well, every now and then you will find that authors on Twitter are saying, does anybody want my old books or my books that are in translation, because authors tend to get author copies. The most successful, I would say, for a school is probably asking around if there can be a school fundraiser. That would be another opportunity. Contacting heritage language schools. I've found in Sheffield we have a grouping of about 23 heritage language schools who all work together, and many of them are delighted to find that somebody's actually interested in supporting this in a formal education context. But if you want to drop me an email, that might have further and longer answers as well. Let me have a look how we're doing. Have you ever had resistance to this from parents who want their children to focus on English alone? Sometimes. And delving into the research, there is a generational aspect to this. So both in my own research and in the research from other people, sometimes the first generation of immigrants who, and I'm grandly generalizing here, but if the first generation of immigrants, say the parents, have faced particular difficulties either in language acquisition or in being accepted in the UK, then the belief that if their child speaks English or speaks English better, they will have a better life, will be better accepted, etc., can lead to this. I've done an intergenerational study which focused on 4 generations in total, and that was the case for the first generation, which in this case came over in the 1960s. But by the time it came on to later generations, there was then this sense of loss. And I think sometimes it's parents who might not have made those distinctions between language and identity. It also depends how well connected the family still is in the other country. Or it might be that the family has got particularly well developed heritage language practices and therefore thinks that school is for English only. Any websites, organisations that set up an international pen pal service for children? Whoever asked that question, can you send me an email? Because yes, I think I do, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. So if you want that, I'm happy to look it up again. It was a while ago that I came across it, and it might not be valid anymore, but I'm happy to look that up. How can this advice be implemented into maths lessons? I've had a master's student who did their master's dissertation on exactly this. And ultimately, maths have got the additional problem that different countries have got different ways of working things out mathematically. I still cannot do long division the way it's done in the UK. I can only do it the way I was taught it in Germany. So in maths, you've got the additional issue that students might have been taught in a different way, and sometimes depending on the school context, on whether things have to be done a certain way, but even if they don't, they might not feel confident questioning or mentioning that they've learned it a different way. So there are additional aspects linked here. I certainly think that in subjects that require very specific subject knowledge, it can be really helpful to create like multilingual cheat sheets, essentially, and enable the child to say, oh yes, I know the word for isosceles triangle in my language, or I don't. And then that is a way of working out whether it is the language that is potentially an issue to understanding, or whether it is the maths knowledge. What goes hand in hand with this is that, again, there is research on this, but math thinking obviously accesses slightly different aspects of the brain. I still do maths in German, and I've been here for way longer than I have been in Germany. But as soon as you give me something complicated in maths, I would do it in German. So that is one very clear, straightforward way of saying to children, actually, you know what, if you want to do that if you want to work that out in a different way, that would be one opportunity. How do you keep your child engaged in the mother tongue if all other media focus mainly on English? I give talks in heritage language schools which focus on this, and I do workshops on this. The short answer is it's really hard. The long answer would probably go, oh my God, it's nearly 12 o'clock, go beyond this talk. It is really difficult, and it is to do with status. And part of it is to do that if schools acknowledge the status, and if society acknowledges the status of other languages, then maintaining that focus is a lot easier. But again, if you email me, I'm very happy to carry on discussing. Do you think that it has to be acknowledged that there must be a difference between multilingual speakers and children that are international new arrivals who are completely new to English? Yes and no, but I think that distinction is probably temporary. So it depends on when and how children arrive and what their level of English is. I'm working on a project at the moment with a young man who arrived from Italy, but is originally from, I want to say, Nigeria. I don't want to get it wrong. And he's been here, I think, about 9 months. And he's now operating quadrilingually. So yes, children who are completely new arrivals, who have no English whatsoever, need different approaches. But at the same time, for them, it is especially important that their home languages are acknowledged. And it's acknowledged that they don't arrive as completely blank sheets, but that they do have prior skills and knowledges as well. Secondary PGCE students starting in September, so very new. How would you help young secondary students who may feel embarrassed by sharing their heritage language knowledge? It's a long time thing. It's not something that will happen overnight. So earlier we talked about sharing your own experiences. There might be a way of drawing attention to your own shortcomings, for example, and say, actually, does anybody know this? So the opportunity to share that knowledge. When I go into schools, the young people don't necessarily always pop up happy to share their knowledge and experiences, because it isn't always cool. But over time, if you create that kind of space, and especially if you talk to them about why that might be important, that'll become easier. Now, we are at 12 o'clock. I'm very happy to carry on and answer questions. So, and maybe we can organise the Multilingual Children's Library as a different talk on another day, but I'll carry on answering questions, and I will just drop the attendee number. I will just watch the numbers drop, and as long as there are questions, I will carry on answering these questions. I hope that's all right with Trish. Would bringing willing parents in to read a story in a different language be a good idea? Yes, yes, absolutely. And there have been fantastic ideas about multilingual story sacks, reading the same story in English. Yes, absolutely. At the Multilingual Children's Library, we did a multilingual readathon where we read the same story in 14 languages. So a fundraiser could be, for example, you know, can you do as many languages as are represented in the class to do Little Red Riding Hood or a different story? Is reaching out to teachers and equipping them with the knowledge and confidence about multilingual identity something that SIG is already doing? It's something, contact me. We are a fairly new special interest group, but yes, it is something that we are doing, and it's the core of my work as well. So please contact me, and I'm happy to get to talk. I'm interested in how families you've spoken to feel about reading with their child in their home language. Many families struggle to support their child reading in English, but if they're struggling reading in another language, the support would be much more limited. Yes, and it depends. I mentioned earlier that families' experiences are really complex and very different. So you will have some who are very confident readers in their language, others are not. So earlier I mentioned one of the ideas would be to have a look at online stories that are available. And if you contact me with languages that would be poignant for you to explore, I'd be very happy to share what I know. So there are other opportunities to potentially access online stories in those languages if the parent isn't necessarily a confident reader. But the other thing is that it's about sharing as well. So sometimes it might be that the parent and the child work out the story in either language jointly. This is where it comes in that if the parent and the child don't necessarily share the same language. How can schools acknowledge the difficulties for families in supporting children at home if they speak limited English themselves? So there are a number of opportunities available, but obviously, so for example, resources like Twinkle have got key sheets available, like for an invitation for parents' evening, etc. Obviously, acknowledging the difficulty is more difficult because it's something that you're creating from scratch as a custom document. But if you ask around schools to try and pool resources, maybe that's something that the special interest group can help with as well, to try and create a document and have it translated into multiple languages and potentially start something that can be shared more widely. How would you suggest finding out and respecting what learning is going on in multilingual homes? That's a really interesting question, because it brings us up against the notion of otherness. So when I work with families and schools, I'm an outsider in both. And as a trained teacher who is multilingual myself, I am quite well recognized as being maybe not neutral. I think when it comes right down to it, I'm still seen as an authority figure, but I'm not a teacher who has a specific beef with the child's learning experience, for example. And I think, again, similar to what I mentioned earlier to the new PGCE student, is that it's a long-term thing. So when something comes out, I would say try it, and then share some of the good practices by way of making ideas happen across the school, and hopefully through seeing that those practices are being respected. That's what the funds of knowledge is all about. The next time you ask around, you will get more people participating, and ultimately that will be a culture change. Whether you have, I don't know, award systems, if you have, you know, somebody recognized for reading in Urdu with their parent, and they win an award for that, you know, those kinds of things. Anything that flags that there is status attached to home practices, home language practices, and that is acknowledged by the school would be helpful. Are there any books in particular that you recommend to share with children? So I think the one that I mentioned earlier, The Town Musicians of Bremen, is a really fun one to share with kids. In fact, it's anything that comes with animal sounds, because that is a folk story that also exists in different versions. So from full-on picture book to something that is quite wordy. So there's different ways of packaging that, because obviously it depends a bit on the age of the children as well. It might also be fun to look at books that originate from other countries. So, for example, books that are not necessarily Anglophone, whether that is the books of Astrid Lindgren, for example, but there are others from many different cultures. And again, I'm very happy to talk to people who contact me. I might have an overflowing inbox after this. How can we support parents to embrace the linguistic development of their mother tongue amidst the pressure of educational expectations at school? Again, I would say similar to previous responses, it's a matter of time, and it's a matter of signalling clearly that that is desired, acknowledged, rewarded. You know, whether, for example, if you have an annual awards ceremony, if you add an award for, you know, heritage languages, and giving parents an opportunity to come together and discuss their thoughts would be another opportunity to create a community around the heritage languages. Quite often, I find in my research that originally parents tend to flock with parents who speak the same language. And of course, you've got potential communication barriers as well if they don't necessarily speak English as well to communicate with others. But once they start talking to each other and they realize that actually the language is secondary and the language practices are what many families have in common, then that might be another way to go about it. In schools where another language apart from English is the language of the majority of skilled children, I've known head teachers who are worried about their language overtaking English, things being communicated that adults cannot understand, or implement loose bans such as English only in the playground classroom. Yes, yes, that exists. I think that is a really big issue. I understand the problem and I understand the fears. I think it goes back to curricular pressures that I was mentioning earlier. But I genuinely think that there are ways of working with families to keep both going. And I think if there is one strong language community in a way that makes it easier than if, like some schools that I've worked with, you've got 23 different languages in one classroom. Some parents have deliberately brought their children to Britain to learn English. Standard English is a second or additional language, non-standard English is their home language. Yes, absolutely, more learning about language would be beneficial. And yes, a module in GCSE about language change. I would love for there to be a linguistics GCSE that is not tied to any specific language. EAL pupils are doing as well as the monolingual peers in English SATs. Is this something to celebrate or to be concerned? I think it's neither. I think it just is. But I think we need to show that ultimately these pupils are doing more than just following the curriculum, just being in quotation marks in one language. And it may or may not be detrimental. I think it's very difficult to look at that from an individual perspective. Is another one, is this something that SIG is already doing? A family learning tutor with ESOL experiences? Yes, please get in touch. I would love to create a bigger network. A piece of good practice from our school, fantastic. One teacher has register language of the week, whereby pupils fill in a short form at the start of the year with good morning and good afternoon in the heritage language. Then every week a different form is pulled out and that child teaches the class how to respond to the register in the heritage language. Brilliant. At a similar level, trying to trigger how many different languages can you make happen is another way to get children to resort to different languages, and also to encourage thinking about language among the Anglophone monolingual pupils. Multilingual, yes, is a great website and a resource for multilingual books. To go with my question before, in school for another language. Yes, how as teachers can we approach senior leaders thinking in this way? With caution, I think. I think we need to throw research at them. I think we need to throw links between language and identity at them, and the knowledge and the showing that the multilingual pupils are not doing worse. And it isn't a planned takeover of another language of the school system. But I'm very happy to go into that in more detail if you want to drop me a message. Opinion on cultural capital and reading and how translated texts within the classroom might heighten the overall cultural capital. Yes, yes, please. There are so many fantastic translated texts, and there is a constant fight on diversifying school libraries that is going on. And if you look at World Kidlit on Twitter, for example, it's a fantastic hashtag to explore. Yes, I think it still maintains and develops the student's heritage identity as well. It can become a bit of a finger pointing, as in, oh, today we're reading a book by a Czech author, and look at who's Czech. So it needs a bit of careful managing. But again, if, for example, you issue a reading challenge, my son at the beginning of his year was given a list of, I don't know how many books, 25 or something. And if you make sure that there are some translated texts in there, that is one opportunity. Or set children a challenge to find some as well, and develop both their research skills and their reading skills at the same time. How can we help multilingual students in secondary schools when their oracy skills are higher and so they pass through the system to reach exams without developing a high level in writing and reading comprehension skills? So I've focused largely on primary today, because I think by the time you get to secondary, and especially when you get to exam periods or exam times in secondary, it gets a lot more complex. Overall, I would say it's hopefully, once they are at the exam stage, it's kind of too late. So it's something that we need to think about earlier. And I think some of that is enabling students to be able to draw on their full linguistic repertoire as they move up the school system. So if they early on become able to draw on all their languages to, say, draft a piece of writing, and then as a teacher we are aware of where the shortfall is. Is it the ability to construct a story, or is it the ability to construct a story in English? And then we can target intervention or help more carefully. Going back to the question in a maths context, what are some of the in-class interventions that can be used if the problem was a language problem? If a student isn't sure what isosceles means. A tailored plenary, yes, absolutely. Google Translate has a lot to offer in terms of help, and I would say not to, and this might be because this is the final question, a good closing commentary. I won't be talking about the Multilingual Children's Library today because time is marching on, but I'm happy to share what I've done with anybody who is interested via a different channel. But coming back to this question, a tailored plenary, maybe as a final plea, is to not forget that the students we are working with are living and breathing experts of their own contexts. When I was working with my own son on his German as he grew up, this is an example that I share quite frequently. He would say that he loved me more than anything in the world. And he said it in German, and there was a grammatical error in it. Now, to be perfectly frank, when my son tells me that he loves me more than anything in the world, I don't care how many mistakes he makes. So I never corrected him on it. And when he found out that he had been making a mistake for quite some time, he got really angry at me because he had trusted me to correct him. And I said to him, well, but sometimes you want me to correct you and sometimes you don't want me to correct you. How do I know when to do which? And he looked at me like I was the most incompetent numpty on the planet and said, well, you ask me. So as a final comment then maybe is that we work with our students and we ask them and talk to them about what it is that they might find helpful, and we try and give them the tools to let us know how to support them. So that might be a tailored plenary, that might be an opportunity for the child to go away and find out what they know, what they don't know, and so we can then tailor the support specifically. Thank you very much to the 51 people who lasted out what turned out to be longer than an hour. Thank you very much for your patience, and as Trish said, there will be a video of this and contact details shared later today. I hope it was interesting. Thank you very much for coming. Bye-bye.